Isn't it like water storage, I think?
Aquifer, it's...
I have no idea. Something underground, I think.
Hot place where they hold water.
Aquifer?
The aquifer is an underground water supply.
Hi, I'm Julie Humphreys. In the next few minutes, we're going to explore what is perhaps the greatest treasure of the inland Northwest, the Spokane Valley Rafton Prairie Aquifer. The Spokane Valley Rafton Prairie Aquifer is the result of what experts agree was the greatest flood in geologic history, the Great Spokane Flood. It took place more than 12,000 years ago during the last ice age. About where western Montana sits today, there was a gigantic lake called Glacial Lake Missoula. It was enormous. It was created by a huge ice sheet that dammed the present-day Clark Fork River near Pend Oreille Lake. But eventually, the ice dam that held back the waters collapsed. Trillions of gallons of water spewed from the dam and flowed west across the Idaho Panhandle over what is now Spokane. A wall of water that would have covered the tallest buildings in downtown Spokane flowed with such force that it moved boulders the size of city buses. Let me show you what happened as a result of this. Watch as I take this garden hose and try and push these rocks, sand, and gravel down the driveway. Notice how the fine sands wash all the way to the street, while the larger rocks settle closer to me. The same thing happened after the Great Spokane Flood. The burst of water from Glacial Lake Missoula deposited the larger boulders first. Huge rocks like this were then scattered all over North Idaho and the Spokane area. Once the flood stopped, the thick boulder and gravel layer filled with water, forming what is today called the Spokane Valley Rafton Prairie Aquifer.
Not to my understanding.
Isn't that underneath the ground?
I don't know, you can't see it, but I imagine it's clear water.
It's under the ground.
Well, it's just water that flows through layers and layers and layers of sand and gravel, I guess.
Water-bearing rock?
It's really hard to imagine what the aquifer looks like. You can think of it as a huge underground treasure chest of moving water. It has a rather fragile cover, the ground above, the land you and I walk on. Water continuously flows in and out of the aquifer. Water constantly flows down into the aquifer as snow melt and rainwater seeps from the surface to the aquifer below. Water is continually drawn out as you and I turn on our faucets, water our lawns, and sip that cool, clear water that is distinctively ours in the inland Northwest. Then it discharges at springs that run to the local river system.
Underneath the Spokane city, underneath the city area.
Spokane, through the valley, and on out.
Not readily.
I'm not sure exactly.
On Trent? By Trent? It's somewhere over in the valley.
The aquifer begins just south of Lake Pend Oreille in North Idaho. It runs south to Lake Coeur d'Alene and flows west to Spokane. Let's head up for a better look. The aquifer is officially called the Spokane Valley Rafton Prairie Aquifer because it lies below the Rafton Prairie in North Idaho and the Spokane Valley in Washington. From up here, you can just imagine how the Great Flood actually rushed down through this valley with the hills on both sides. In some areas, like Athol and Rathdrum in North Idaho, the aquifer is about 250 to 300 feet below ground. Over there in Coeur d'Alene, the aquifer is as close as 100 to 200 feet underground. In a few places, like that gravel pit below, the aquifer is actually exposed. That's why it is protected with fencing. The aquifer recharges itself. It continually receives new water in the form of rainfall and snowmelt that seep down below the surface. You can see this here as the waters have seeped down below the surface into the aquifer at a recharge area near Hauser Lake. This great resource, our aquifer, can be contaminated. Let's look at an example. Here's a column of rocks and soil. At the bottom is water. Now think of the rocks and soil on top as the ground you and I walk on, and the water at the bottom as the aquifer. Let's pour this glass of water through it. This is how snowmelt and rain recharge the aquifer. Now let's mix a little motor oil or paint or old antifreeze and do the same thing. See what happens? Since the ground above the aquifer is porous, it allows impurities like these to seep down from the surface into the aquifer. Eventually, this water is drawn from the aquifer for drinking water and other household uses. This is what can happen to our drinking water. Can you imagine bathing in this? Or drinking this? Or giving your pet this? This is why it is so important to protect the aquifer. To protect the aquifer, the source of our drinking water, we must prevent what I have just demonstrated from happening. And this is where you come in. Pay close attention in the next few minutes. Learn about the aquifer and what you can do to prevent it from being contaminated. Let's look at some of the things that we need to prevent, things that can contaminate the aquifer. The major source of aquifer contamination is from sanitary household waste, things you pour down the drain, down the toilet, from things you dispose of improperly, and from homes that rely on septic tanks, not public sewer systems. People have an odd habit of pouring things down the drain or flushing items down the toilet that just don't get treated well with our wastewater system. Solvents, paint thinners, non-biodegradable cleaners, antifreeze, oven cleaners, insecticides, and pest chemicals are not things to have in your drinking water. Municipal treatment facilities like this in Spokane treat and filter out waste. But to be safe, as a general rule of thumb, you should never pour anything down the drain that you don't want to drink or bathe in. Properly dispose of your old paints, thinners, fertilizers, and solvents by either sharing what you don't use with somebody else or by taking them to your local transfer station, like this one on Ramsey Road in Coeur d'Alene, that accepts non-mixed, marked hazardous items. A major form of harmful waste is caused by homes that are not on public sewer systems. Homes like this must rely on septic tanks for disposal of dirty water waste from drains, sinks, and toilets. Waste from septic tanks can ultimately result in harmful nitrates that can contaminate our aquifer, which in many places is as shallow as 30 feet below ground. These can pose health risks and shut down our water supply. Sewer construction like this should be supported. Granted, it costs money, but in the long run, the expense is less than the cost of dealing with a contaminated water supply. Remember, the potential for aquifer contamination is much greater if you are on a septic tank system than public sewer. Another potential source of contamination is one that most of us never even think of. It is stormwater runoff. This is stormwater runoff, and so is this, and this. When it rains or when the snows melt, water washes down into the soil or flows into dry wells. Then it seeps toward the aquifer below. Stormwater can wash oil, solvents, chemicals, fertilizers, and other harmful things off road surfaces and into dry wells where they discharge into the ground. Or storm sewers like this that may wind up in the Spokane River. These contaminants may contain potentially harmful amounts of nitrates, arsenic, mercury, lead, and toxins. Stormwater that goes into dry wells may end up in your drinking water, carrying contaminants with it. Now you've seen how household chemicals, sanitary waste, and stormwater can potentially contaminate the aquifer and what you can do to prevent it. There are, however, other seemingly harmless ways that people can harm our water supply. Here's a good example now. It appears this man is innocently fertilizing his lawn. Actually, he is posing two risks to the aquifer. First of all, he failed to read the manufacturer's recommended application. More is not necessarily better. In this case, he is applying double the recommended amount. The soil just will not hold that much. The excess can seep down into the soil, and in a matter of feet, it has an unobstructed pathway right to the aquifer below. And look over here. His applicator is spreading fertilizer all over the street. This can wash down into a dry well and, just like stormwater, can contaminate the aquifer or flow into a river or stream. One person's mistake may not seem like much harm, but consider if 100 people did the same thing. Let's look over here. Look who's changing the oil. And what will he do with his waste oil? You can't let oil, old paint, or solvents lay on the ground. Eventually, they too will seep down into the ground or into a dry well and right into the aquifer. Always properly dispose of used motor oils, paints, antifreeze, fertilizers, and insecticides. Store them properly. If you're not going to use them, either give them to someone who will, or take them to your local transfer station where hazardous chemicals are properly disposed. Again, one person's mistake may not seem like much harm, but consider if 100 people did the same thing. And remember, there are thousands of us living right on top of our drinking water supply. North Idaho and Spokane County are projected to grow up to 20% in population by the year 2000. This dramatic increase in population poses a threat to our aquifer. We all need to be aware of the vulnerability of our water supply to contamination. Let's see activities currently underway to protect our aquifer. In commercial business applications where large amounts of fuel, solvents, and potentially harmful materials are stored, secondary containment systems are being installed. Large above-ground storage tanks like these must have double-lined containers and other containment measures. Like this concrete bed that has been constructed in the unlikely event of a leak in one of these chemical storage drums. In addition, service stations are required to install double-wall tanks for gasoline, diesel, and other petroleum products, along with liners to prevent leaks and spills. You may have noticed that landfill sites have been closed. Garbage used to be buried at landfills, where hazardous chemicals ultimately leach down into the aquifer. Garbage is now taken to the waste-to-energy facility, where energy is recovered as electricity. Grassy swales like this are now required over the aquifer to catch and treat stormwater washed off of roofs, pavement, and other surfaces. These swales actually clean up the water as it moves downward through the grass and soil layer. A key protection measure now being taken to protect the aquifer in areas like this, where there are no municipal treatment facilities, is called the 5-acre rule. Property owners must have a minimum of 5 acres of land per household in order to have a septic tank method of disposal. This controls the sheer number and density of septic tanks, thereby protecting the aquifer from contamination. See those parcels of land below and how the houses are spaced far apart? Well, that is the effect of the 5-acre rule. The most significant aquifer protection activity is bringing sewers to areas over the aquifer like this, where septic tanks are still in use. Eventually, all homes in densely populated areas will have municipal sewer treatment facilities. You can now understand why it is important to protect the aquifer. If you add up every single act, a little too much fertilizer here, septic tank waste there, dumping old motor oil, and then multiply these by the thousands of residents that may or may not consciously know of the consequences of these actions and the severe potential of contaminating the aquifer, well, then you realize what we must do to protect our water. Make it a habit to properly use and store paints, automotive products, insecticides, and hazardous chemicals. Remember, if you can't use all of it, give it to someone who can. Otherwise, put it in a container, mark its contents, and take it to your local transfer station. If you live in an area that is not on public sewer, get involved now. Support sewer construction in your area. If you see anyone or any business carelessly disposing of old motor oils, solvents, or hazardous chemicals, stop them. Water. It gives life to everything. Here in the inland Northwest, it is so important, and it's so precious. See this? It's Three Springs. It's at the base of Pettit Drive near Fort Wright in Spokane. Many of us see it each year as we trudge up that monstrous hill in the Lilac Bloomsday Run. Right here, the aquifer actually bubbles up from the ground. It's almost a miracle. See this sign? It's for the Aqua Force. It represents the commitment of people like you to take actions now and in the future to protect our aquifer. It's time to be responsible, to protect that which is all of ours. You can be one of the Aqua Force, one of the more than 400,000 residents in northern Idaho and Spokane County who depend on the aquifer each day and want to protect it and keep it safe. This program has been brought to you in the public interest by Spokane County Water Quality Management, State of Idaho Division of Environmental Quality, Panhandle Health District, and paid for in part by a grant from the United States Environmental Protection Agency.
It's a place where we get our drinking water.
Water table that runs under the valley.
The aquifer is an underground water supply.
It's the water that runs underground from, well, into Spokane.
The aquifer is important to all of us. We must protect it.